What is Jerusalem worth?
Nothing. Everything.
Many people often view the conflict between Israel and Palestine through rose-colored glasses, defining the spectrum between black and white, right and wrong.
You are a hypocrite for calling this about land!
It represents the biggest loss of life in a single day in Israeli history.
But is this really the case? Is this conflict a battle between the good guys and the bad guys, as many try to make it seem? Or is it more complicated than that? We'll be treading on a fine line here, as we attempt to present an unbiased account of the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict. If you've been particularly interested in understanding what exactly is going on between these two sides, this video is the one for you. Let's dive in. The genesis of the conflict. The morning of Saturday, October 7, 2023, started as an ordinary day in Israel. Everyone went about their daily business, unaware of the fact that this would be a day to remember in the history of the State of Israel and the Middle East at large. Suddenly, without warning, the sky over Israel lit up. But these were no fireworks. Instead, it was Hamas taking the battle to Israel. Thousands of these rockets entered the Israeli atmosphere as the first wave of attacks struck targets as far away as Tel Aviv and the outskirts of Jerusalem, who are generally spared of the effects of the previous conflicts, due to the powerful defense provided by the Iron Dome. But Hamas was just getting started. Just an hour after the first rocket launch, Israel experienced something it had not seen for the past 50 years. For the first time in a very long time, Hamas militants infiltrated Israeli territories, gaining access to as much as 22 Israeli towns and army bases. The scenes unfolded like something off a Hollywood movie, as walls of defense, surveillance systems, and border guards were crushed as the Hamas militants made their way into the streets. In their wake, they left a trail of bloodshed, the likes of which Israel had not seen in a very long time. Authorities described the attacks as unprecedented, but this wasn't even the worst part of the day. As the Hamas mission continued, the militants came in contact with a heavy Israeli crowd who had been felicitating at a nearby Israeli carnival. The horrific scenes that followed are nothing that can be described. Hundreds were killed and hundreds more kidnapped, and their fate remains unknown, as they have become pawns in a deadly game of negotiations and compromise. This brazen attack, which left some 700 Israeli soldiers dead in one single day, came as a shock both to the Palestinians and the Israelis. This was where things got even more deadly. Following these attacks, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared a state of war, and thus began a wave of terrible rocket attacks on Gaza. Houses have been leveled to the ground, thousands of innocent lives have been lost, and some 300,000 Israeli reserves have been pulled from their homes to defend Israel from the attacks. This conflict, which has been brewing for a very long time, has come as a shock to the international community, although everyone knew it was a matter of time before something like this happened anyway. Now, we know you're probably here because you want to understand what exactly has led to this bloodshed and exchange of fire from both sides. In this video, we will attempt to take you back through the very history of this fiercely contested land, previous conflicts, and why the events that have culminated in this war. If we decide to judge this conflict from one single event, we will be doing ourselves and the people involved a disservice. So we will attempt to provide an unbiased, non-judgmental approach in our study of this delicate subject. To understand why Israel and Palestine are always at odds end, let us go back to the beginning, and we mean the very beginning. The birth of the Kingdom of Israel. Although many historians believe that it isn't absolutely necessary to begin the study of the history of this fiercely contested region from the very beginning, we feel it is absolutely necessary that we go back to the time when humans began to lay claim on this land in the first place. This will help us understand why both parties feel an undeniable attachment to the land, and why each side has refused to fully compromise after so many attempts at peace. Pay attention as we attempt to fix together every broken piece of this ancient history that has led to much bloodshed and countless wars. Travel with us back in time to 930 BC, the year many believe the United Kingdom of Israel was created in the approximate location where Israel and Palestine exist today. Following their exodus from Egypt, the Jewish people are believed to have formed their own kingdom under the rule of King Saul. This monarchy system continued after Saul's succession by King David and then by his son Solomon, who built the first temple in the Kingdom of Israel. Now, this temple is very significant in considering the history of this land because the same spot where this Judaistic temple is believed to have been built is the same spot, Temple Mount, where the Dome of the Rock, built by Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan between 685 AD and 691 AD, was constructed. Right here in Jerusalem is where this holy site now exists. So you should see why Jerusalem has often been seen as a major bone of contention when discussing which territory belongs to whom and what land can be claimed by whom. Both the Christians, Muslims, and Jews lay claim on Jerusalem as their holy land, and this has led to rising tensions for many years. However, these claims of the existence of the Kingdom of Israel back in ancient times have been contested by historians who believe that nothing like that ever existed. Archaeological findings and deep research into the history of the area have produced very little result in settling the arguments as to who occupied the lands first. But is that really what these recent conflicts are even all about? Well, that depends on who you ask. Having established the timeline of the existence of the ancient Kingdom of Israel, the big question then remains how this area became such a huge conflict zone. Please remember that this video does not aim to take sides with anyone or point accusing fingers. This is a simple historical account that is open to interpretation. Palestine and the Ottoman Empire. Fast forward to 1516 and the Ottoman Turks' invasion of the vast expanse of land known as Palestine. This occupation lasted between 1516 and 1918. That's some 402 years of Palestinian existence under the rule of the Ottoman Empire. You should understand that this Palestine we talk about isn't the same as it is today. At the time, the region was inhabited by both the Jews, Christians, and the Arabs. However, in 1918, something dramatic happened that has significantly altered the course of history for decades. You guessed it. The First World War came calling and eventually brought an end to the Ottoman Empire. As the British battled this Turkish empire, they realized they couldn't defeat them on their own, so they enlisted the able hands of the Arabs and the Jews who lived under the Ottoman rule. Both parties were promised autonomy and the right to their own statehood within the same territory. How exactly the British planned to achieve this remains unclear, but surprisingly, the plan worked. After the First World War ended in 1918, the responsibility for the administration of the area regarded as Palestine was handed over to the British. The League of Nations also issued a British mandate for Palestine, a document that handed over the administrative control of the region over to the British. But there was one tiny clause in this document that has since brought so much terror and bloodshed to the region. This was a provision demanding the establishment of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine, an agreement that went into effect in 1923. During the course of the establishment of this mandate, over 100,000 Jews found their way back to their perceived homeland, much to the dismay of the Arab population. World War II and the Holocaust of the Jews had an even bigger impact on this massive exodus, as hundreds of thousands of Jews worldwide decided to seek refuge in their supposed ancestral homeland. But keep in mind that this was then occupied by the Arab Palestinians, who were very much unwilling to give up their homes to anyone. The Partition Plan. So how did the authorities try to solve this problem? Well, back in 1947, the United Nations proposed a plan to partition Palestine into two separate sections, following over 2 decades of British rule. This partition was aimed at maintaining a peaceful coexistence between the Jews and Palestinian Arabs. This ambitious plan was aimed at partitioning the land into 2 sections, with an independent Jewish state on one hand and an independent Arab state on the other hand. Simple, right? Not really. One big question was what exactly the United Nations planned to do with Jerusalem. This much conflicted territory was considered a holy land by both the Jews and the Arabs, who believed that the region should be seceded to them. To solve this dilemma, the United Nations proposed a simple solution: Jerusalem would remain an international territory belonging to neither of the two parties. The administration of this neutral region would also fall to the international community. That seemed to solve the problem, or did it? However, as ambitious as this plan was, it almost worked out. But there was also another tiny issue. You see, for such an agreement to come into effect, both the Palestinian Jews and the Palestinian Arabs had to agree to the terms and the marked territories. Even though the plan was very much agreed to by the Zionist movement, who saw the move as an opportunity to finally establish their lifelong dreams of having a place to call the land of Israel, the Arabs had something entirely different in mind. The Palestinian Arabs, who held on and still hold on to the fact that the statehood of Israel was illegal and Israel as a state should not exist at all, refused to succumb to the pressures of the international community, and thus conflicts began to break out in the region.
حالة الصلف الإسرائيلي تجاه أي محاولات لإبرام اتفاق سلام.
This history we are delving into is a very complicated story, deeply rooted in history, and the fight for a place to call home. Now, we might not get every single detail of this story right, and we'd like to apologize for that in advance. Although we would love to maintain a balanced outlook of this story, because this is, of course, a very delicate issue that involves several innocent lives. Please forgive any intrusion and mistakes that might make it seem as though this video is taking any sides or misinterpreting history. This is not our intention, and we will strive to maintain accuracy in historical depictions as much as possible. So, what was this partition plan like? Well, the Palestinians were assigned lands within the Gaza Strip, bordering Egypt, as well as land in the West Bank, bordering Jordan. The rest, apart from Jerusalem, belonged to Israel. Because the Palestinian Arabs believed they had a higher population, they believed the sharing of the land was unfair, and they should have been granted access to more land. This instantly led to much contention between the two parties. But everything took a troubling turn in May 1948 when Israel did something absolutely dramatic. The statehood of Israel. Obviously, Israel had no issues with the partition plan and was more than willing to go along with it. So in May 1948, they took a huge move that ultimately led to so many conflicts, as we are still having today. As Britain finally pulled out of the Palestine region, after discovered that it could not solve the problem between the two sides, Israel declared its statehood and began to exist as an independent state, leaving Arab Palestine in a state of limbo. But they weren't going to let this slide. As a matter of fact, all the bordering Arab nations who had nursed a dream of forming a central Arab state were not just going to let Israel take the shine. This led to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War that pitted Israel against 5 Arab nations: Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon. Together, these 5 nations barraged Israel from every side, but amazingly, Israel won the war. It was a pretty remarkable feat for such a young, small nation, but they didn't do it alone. Israel had the support of the then President of the United States, which played a significant role in the course of the war. By July 1949, when the war ended, Israel was in control of more than 2/3 of the former British mandate. The West Bank was in the hands of Jordan, and Egypt was in control of the Gaza Strip. This conflict remains one of the greatest conflicts to ever arise in Israel. It ultimately opened a new chapter in the struggle between the people of Palestine and what is now modern-day Israel. The birth of the PLO. From the ashes of the defeat of the Arab-Israeli War, a new demon arose that terrorized the region for many, many years. Enter the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, formed with the express purpose of establishing an autonomous and independent Palestine Arab state on the land, which they believed was now being occupied illegally by the State of Israel. Trouble in paradise, right? Things weren't looking so good at the time, and there were several clashes and conflicts between the IDF and the PLO. To add more fuel to this dramatic interplay, the memorandum of the establishment of the PLO featured one major goal, which was the destruction of the entire state of Israel as a means of achieving the creation of the Palestine Arab state. This meant that both states would not exist side by side, but one would have to be destroyed before the other could stand. Do you see how complicated things have gotten now? After several years, the PLO, however, agreed to the Oslo Accords in 1993. This document signified the PLO's recognition of the statehood of Israel in exchange for the formal recognition of the PLO by Israel.
I am sorry to say that your mass media, the Western mass media, always beside the Israelis. Your baby.
You should remember Yasser Arafat. He was the chairman of the PLO at the time, and he held on to this position until his death in 2004. The SixDay War. April 1967 was a terrible time in history. In this period, a terrible war took place between Israel and its neighbors, the likes of which could only be rivaled by the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. But how did it start? And more importantly, how did it end? We trace the genesis of the war back to some diplomatic frictions and skirmishes between the State of Israel and its neighbors. Everything reached its peak in April 1967, when Israel and Syria engaged in a ferocious air and artillery battle, which led to the destruction of 6 Syrian fighter jets. After obtaining false intelligence from the Soviet Union that Israel was planning to move into its territories, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser commanded his forces to march into the Sinai Peninsula.
فعلا أيها الإخوة الشعب العربي شعب واحد والجيش العربي جيش واحد ولن يفرق بيننا.
This move led to the expelling of the UN peacekeeping force, which had been guarding the border for over a decade. Now, it was a full-scale war. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a devastating preemptive aerial attack against Egypt, although both nations kept claiming self-defense as the reason for their military actions. The conflict also drew in Jordan and Syria, who came to Egypt's defense, before the war eventually ended on June 10. The conflict later came to be known as the Six-Day War, and at the end of the day, Israel was left with more land than it even had in the beginning of the war. By the end of the conflict, Israel had taken control of the Gaza Strip, which was previously under the control of Arab-Palestine. The West Bank had also fallen into the hands of the Israelis, as well as the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. However, the Sinai Peninsula was later relinquished to Egypt, following a peace accord and some tiny little compromises. The First Intifada and the Oslo Accords. Following the conquest of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip by the Israeli forces, something absolutely dramatic began to happen. Israeli citizens began to move into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, building settlements and taking over lands that had previously belonged to the Palestinians. This, of course, didn't sit well with the Palestinians because, of course, why would you come into my home and chase me out? This led to so many clashes and conflicts over the years. The most significant was in 1987. This is the story of the First Intifada. As the anger of the Palestinians boiled over, armed militias could no longer just talk tough. They began to attack the Israelis, launching several unprecedented attacks into Israeli territories. Violent protests and riots filled the streets. Hundreds of people died, both on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side. Ultimately, a peace accord known as the Oslo Peace Accords was agreed upon. We talked about this one earlier in the video. Now, let's dive a little deeper into the agreement and what it means for the Palestinians and the Israelis alike. The first Oslo Accord, or Oslo I, created a timetable for a Middle East peace process, as well as a plan for an interim Palestinian government in parts of Gaza and the West Bank. This agreement was signed in 1993, witnessed by Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel, and Yasser Arafat, the Prime Minister of Palestine. Are you following? Then in 1995, the second agreement, known as Oslo II, was agreed upon. It laid the groundwork for a complete withdrawal of the Israeli troops from parts of the West Bank and other areas. It also set a schedule for a Palestinian Legislative Council elections that would help establish a working government for the Palestinian people. Unfortunately, this romanticized idea never fully worked out. If it did, we probably wouldn't be in this mess that we are right now. The Second Intifada. The whole world was placed on the edge of its seats as news of conflicts breaking out between Palestine and Israel spread around the world in September 2000. But what led to another conflict? Everything was going on well, wasn't it? Well, the story of this next bloody conflict centers around this man, Ariel Sharon. So who is he? And how did he wield so much power to have been able to inspire such a terrible event? Ariel Sharon is a right-wing Jewish Israeli who would later go on to become Israel's prime minister. The events that led to the Second Intifada centers around his visit to the Muslim holy site at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. This visit was considered offensive by most Palestinians, and so they began to protest. The next couple of days were filled with riots, suicide bombings targeted at Israeli civilians and public property. Several other attacks broke out in several places around the region. But this was no small incident. As a matter of fact, the Second Intifada lasted for a staggering 5 years. So that means for nearly 5 years there was constant active tension between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Everything came to an end in August of 2005, when the Israeli army finally pulled out of Gaza after a long, bloody battle.
Israeli troops have started their withdrawal from Gaza after Israel and Hamas militants declared an end to their 3-week conflict.
But this wasn't the end of the struggle. In fact, things were just about to take a terrible turn. Now, it's time for today's subscriber pick. With the recent events currently unfolding in the Gaza Strip and Israeli territories, people everywhere have been divided over which side to take. While the Palestinians maintain that their autonomy should be without question, the Israelis believe they have a right to defend their territory from attacks. What is your view on the ongoing conflict? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. Now back to the video. The Birth of Hamas. If you're not really familiar with the story of Israel and Palestine, or your curiosity has just sent you down this rabbit hole based on recent events, here's a little introduction. Hamas, although it sounds like the name of one person, is indeed a group. This group of Sunni Islamists became a prominent figure in the Palestinian community when it won the legislative elections in 2006. Now, you're probably wondering, how does an armed group win elections in a place like Palestine? Yes, that's because Hamas is not just an armed group, but also a political entity. This sudden rise in rank for Hamas didn't sit well with Fatah, the political group behind the PLO. The two sides had some fighting and some conflicts, all of which ended in 2007, when Hamas defeated Fatah in a battle for Gaza. Since the creation of Hamas, many nations have considered them a terrorist organization. This is because Hamas has been known to carry out suicide bombings and is always calling for the destruction of the State of Israel. This brings us back to a problem that was thought to have been solved, which was the agreement on the coexistence of the two states as a prerequisite for peace in the region. Since Hamas rose to prominence, it has continued to engage the State of Israel in countless battles of different proportions. Let us examine some of the most terrible ones and how devastating they were for both sides. Operation Cast Lead. Between December 2008 and January 2009, the two conflicting sides experienced some of the worst fighting in history. For 3 weeks, Israel barraged the Gaza Strip with rockets, in response to the rocket fire that was launched by Hamas from the region. Israeli forces also attacked both military and civilian targets, as well as police stations and government buildings. Ultimately, everything came to a chilling end on January 18, 2009, when Israel declared an end to the conflict. By January 21, it had completed its withdrawal. But things would never return to normal. Operation Pillar of Defense. Fighting resumed again in 2012, following the assassination of Ahmed Jabari, the chief of the Gaza military wing of Hamas, by an Israeli airstrike on November 14. This attack was preceded by several pockets of violence between the Israelis and the Palestinians. This was especially escalated when Hamas launched over 100 rockets at Israel within a 24-hour period. Israeli officials claimed the attack was to halt the Hamas rocket attacks, which were targeted at civilians. But the Palestinians could also point fingers. They cited the constant occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the blockade of the Gaza Strip as the reason behind the rocket attacks. According to records, the IDF is believed to have struck some 1,500 sites in the Gaza Strip, including rocket launch pads, government facilities, as well as apartment blocks. According to the UNHCR, about 174 Palestinians were killed in the assaults, which also left hundreds injured. So many families lost their homes, and many of the casualties were even caused by misfired Hamas rockets, which landed in the Gaza Strip. As a matter of fact, of the 1,456 rockets that were launched toward Israel during Operation Stones of Baked Clay, 142 fell inside Gaza itself. But casualties on the Israeli side weren't that intense. By the end of the conflict, 6 Israelis had been killed and 240 were injured. Beyond the politics in these wars, the people on both sides go through extreme psychological traumas, living in fear of a violent breakout, which could occur at any moment. The 2014 Gaza War. The fears of the inhabitants of both sides of the conflict became a reality again in 2014, when fighting resumed between the two parties. But how did this conflict start? Historians credit the genesis of this war with the kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers in the occupied West Bank by a terrorist organization that was affiliated with Hamas. This was the beginning of one of the most brutal open-air conflicts between Israel and Hamas. In response to this audacious crime, Israeli forces launched Operation Brother's Keeper, which saw to the arrest of some 350 active Hamas militants in the West Bank. In response to this act of defiance, Hamas launched multiple rockets toward Israel, thus triggering a 7-week-long conflict between the two warring sides. The ensuing violence led to the death of about 2,000 civilians and soldiers, including women and children. However, most of these casualties were on the Palestinian side, which was a common occurrence in previous conflicts. This time around, Israel was not just fighting Hamas. Other armed groups also joined in the fight, including the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or PIJ, and other Palestinian militant groups. By July 17, the conflict had expanded to include a full-scale ground invasion of the Gaza Strip. The IDF made this move in an attempt to destroy Gaza's tunnel system, which played a huge role in the success and the continued existence of Hamas. On August 5, the ground invasion ended, and on August 26, a ceasefire agreement was reached. In total, over 4,500 mortars and rockets had been fired into Israel by the militant groups, and most of them either landed inside Gaza, didn't do much damage to the Israeli facilities they landed in, or landed in some open areas. However, the campaign on the Israeli side destroyed 34 known tunnel systems, as well as 1/3 of Hamas's 10,000 rocket arsenal, which were either used up or destroyed, according to reports. The conflict resulted in the death of over 2,000 residents of Gaza, and over 10,000 were injured, including women and children. 1,000 out of these injured people were left permanently disabled. Many homes were also razed to the ground or destroyed by rockets, and the livelihood of the common man was set back, as many families dropped to refugee status. Operation Guardian of the Walls. The last time there was tension between Israel and 2021, following an escalation of the pockets of violence that occurred throughout the region. Once again, rockets were launched. Some 94 buildings were destroyed in Gaza, including the complex that housed offices of the Associated Press, the Al Jazeera media network, as well as some other news outlets. By the end of the conflict, 256 Palestinians were dead, including women and children. The ceasefire was mediated by Egypt on May 21, 2021, after which everything took on a false sense of calmness. This fragile peace was shattered on October 7, 2023, following Hamas' invasion of Israeli territories. We pray for peaceful resolutions, as we call on both governments to sit down at the table and agree on a solution that will bring long-lasting tranquility to the region. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next one.